Thank you, Chair, and welcome everybody to the committee. Some great testimony today. A couple of things that I'd like to highlight today, which I think are very, very important. First off, welcome, Mr. Mintz. It's great to see you. I enjoy reading the literature and the research you put out. I try to read everyone's from C.D. Howe to MLI to Fraser, and sometimes even to the Canadian Centre for Policy Alternatives, which I'm tending more on the center on the other side. Today's a good day, I think. And I say this in a lot of ways because today's not only a great day, but I think this actual decade is Canada's decade. And when I say that based on the investments of our government, based on the resources and the human capital we have in this beautiful country. The IMF came out with their economic forecast today. And in 2025, Canada will lead the G7. And I was looking at the numbers right here, and it says Canada will have 2.4% economic growth rate for 2025, better than the United States, the Euro area, and every country within the Euro area, Japan, and the United Kingdom. And we know that, and I say this to everyone gathered here, economic growth is hard to generate in a country. You have to have a lot of things in there. The recipe has to be done right. And I think we've largely done a lot of good things. The other thing I wanted to note is within the report, it talks about inflation. And I'm going to take a minute to read what it says about the inflation we very much experienced, because there's two different types of inflation. You know this, Mr. Mintz, and many of the folks here. You're going to have it driven by central bank policy, like in other countries in Africa or Venezuela, printing of money, or you can have a supply and demand shock, which we had during COVID. And I pretty much respect the folks at the IMF and the World Bank and the economists there, people who have PhDs and master's degree in economics, people who do really, really interesting work and lead what I would say the global economy in many ways. It's led by individuals on the ground like my wonderful residents. And when it says the war in Ukraine led to spikes in commodity prices, evidence suggests that the pass-through of sectoral price pressures to core inflation and the steepening of the inflation-slack relationship, that is the Phillips curve, are essential to understanding the global surge in inflation. This evidence is consistent with key sectors hitting their supply bottlenecks as demand rotated across sectors and was boosted over time by a drawdown of savings. This chapter offers a new lesson and confirms an old one for monetary policy. In extreme cases, when sectoral supply bottlenecks are widespread across an economy, interact with strong demand, inflation can surge. We had some bottlenecks during COVID, and then we had hits to commodity prices in Ukraine, and that's where we got our inflation, not the other way around. And I think that's important to understand because now inflation has come back down. And the chapter is called The Great Tightening, Insights from the Recent Inflation Episode. As an economist, as someone did a graduate degree and could have went on and did his PhD, I chose to go to Wall Street instead. This is important because this is policy, and we know policy is important. And I needed to say that out there because, yes, this is Canada's decade. It absolutely is. We need to do a few more things for sure, but I think largely we've gotten it right. The per capita GDP argument, we had a population surge in Canada with temporary foreign workers and students, but we're going there. My question is actually to Mr. Francois Couillard. Francois. No, you don't get the answer. We'll talk about that anytime.
And now we're going to MP Chambers.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. Thank you for the attendance of our witnesses. Dr. Mintz, I'll start with you. Why should we be concerned with GDP per capita and not just GDP growth, as my friend was referencing earlier?
Well, I think, first of all, this is a very simple equation, and that is, and I'll try to describe it simply. And by the way, I enjoyed Mr. Sabero's lecture. And at some point, maybe we'll have a discussion. But anyway. Growth is equal to per capita growth, and the growth rate is equal to the growth rate in per capita GDP plus population growth, roughly. So if our growth rate, for example, is, let's say this current year is 0.9%, I believe, for GDP for 2024. Who knows what will happen in 2025? Even the IMF, who I taught some of the people who are there, I don't know. These forecasts are kind of hard to do, I think, even given all the uncertainty these days. But just taking this year, you have 0.9% growth in GDP for Canada, if I recall the number correctly. The growth in population has been a little over 2%. So that means our per capita GDP has fallen by 2%, or minus 0.9%. So it means
So if I can get
declined because all our GDP growth in the past couple of years, or almost 3 years now, has been due to population increase, but and our per capita GDP has actually dropped.
So using the economic pie analogy, the pie is getting bigger, but the slices are actually getting smaller.
I think that's a good way to put it. And I think we also have to remember that per capita GDP growth depends on two factors. One is productivity, which has been virtually zero over the past 5 years. And productivity is the amount of GDP per working hour. But it's also affected by the employment rate and unemployment rate. And one of the things that's happened, 2 years ago, July 2022, we actually, which is good news, we actually had the lowest unemployment rate that we've had for quite a long time, was 4.9%, but has now climbed up to 6.6% in August, and it's now 6.5% in September. But the number of unemployed has increased quite dramatically to almost 1.4 million people, almost over 400,000 people since in 2 years. And what's really concerning is that 1/3 of that are young people between the ages of 15 to 24. And so not only there are people that can't buy a home, but there are people that aren't young people that are having trouble getting jobs. And I think that is a huge concern that we have to be worried about.
Thank you very much. Just quickly before I move on, I just want to confirm, kind of brief yes or no. Your testimony was 50% of those impacted by the capital gains actually make less than $117,000 otherwise would make less than $117,000 a year. That $90 billion we see a loss of $90 billion of GDP and an increase of unemployment of about 400,000. Do I have that correct? Okay.
That's correct, yes.
Okay. Thank you very much.
Oh, yes, and I should add, there's a paper that City Hall is going to be putting out of mine that gives a lot of the references and detail, and it will be available in answer to Mr. Sunbury.
Thank you very much.
Mr. Chair, Dr. Mintz, our friend Mr. Sorbera, in his lecture or cabinet audition, I couldn't tell which one it was, painted a very rosy picture that Canadians have never had it better. It's something I think the Liberals continue to mislead Canadians about, that they've never had it so good. We know because the Bank of Canada has confirmed that Canada is in a break glass productivity crisis right now. GDP per person is on the decline. We also know that private sector job growth is flat or declining as well. So I just wanted to give you some time to respond to Mr. Sorbera and the Liberals about this, in our opinion, a very misleading fact that Canadians have never had it so good, and what that means to Canadian standards of living, which we know are declining.
Well, first of all, I really wish I could agree completely with Mr. Sorbera that it's wonderful, and this is going to be a great decade that's going to come across. In fact, tomorrow morning I'm giving a speech at 8 o'clock in the morning, which is why I'm here, and it's going to be exactly on this topic. But just to be very brief, our per capita GDP has now dropped so much below the U.S., where the U.S. per capita GDP is now 50% higher than Canada. I think it's the biggest gap that we've had for quite a long time. And there's a huge amount of pressures that come with that. And I just saw something today, Ontario's per capita GDP is now equal to Alabama. That's not great. And I think, and we have to understand that we start losing some of our many people, young people particularly, who feel they don't have an opportunity here in Canada, and the incomes are much better. In fact, right now I'm working with somebody on some very interesting immigration data. And what we're finding actually is that one of the major factors that influence people moving to the United States, this is just the past few years, has been better economic opportunities in the United States, more so than family. So it surprised me. So I think that's going to be, and by the way, taxes also play a role, but not as big as just simply much higher incomes that are available. And we also ask people how they're doing, whether they're disappointed with what they ended up with in the United States or not. And it's quite the opposite. They've been actually quite, it's turned out better than they expected on the whole. So, I think we have to, I think we need to be very worried about this. And if our standard of living is declining, it means that we won't have the income and we won't have the taxes to pay for many of the things like art. I'm very concerned about the food issue. I think that's a major issue. But it's the richer societies that can afford paying for these things, and if it's the poorer societies that have a lot more difficulty. So I think that, and I won't go into all the details now, but I think that the next 5 years are going to be very challenging for Canada. And I wish I could agree with Mr. Sabero, but I don't.
I remember in 2014, I used to read articles with headlines such as, "The American Dream has moved to Canada." That was under Conservative government. And just up until last year, there was headlines that said, "The Canadian Dream is gone." Can you explain a little bit about that? I know you talked about youth and why they're moving out of here, but can you talk a little bit more about, is that economic issues? Does that have to do with investment? Like, what is it that changed?
Well, we've had very poor private investment now for almost a decade, since the 2014 crash in commodity prices. We have to remember we are a resource-based economy, so it's very important. But many of the sectors have not done very well in investment, and so we're not growing. Businesses are not adopting the most latest technologies. In fact, our research and development has actually dropped in the past decade. When you look at some countries, even the United States is far more than what we have here. And of course, we've seen with the United States, the technology industry has really, been a huge factor underlying its growth. What
are some of those barriers that are stopping from that investment coming into Canada? Why is it going the opposite way?
I think there's a number of factors, but I think regulatory factors play a very big role. We can go into a lot of detail about that. I think in the case of taxation, I think some areas of taxation play a role, but we have to remember there's been some things that we've done since 2000 that have been good, encouraging investment. But I think right now there's been a real discouragement of it in terms of the past number of years. We've been raising taxes in a number of areas, of which capital gains tax is one recent one.
Last question for you. We hear about the Liberals saying this is all about, they want to bring in generational fairness. But when we look at all these taxes, the carbon tax, which you talked about with my colleague, capital gains tax hike, declining GDP per capita, higher deficits, the doubling of the debt, is this really generational fairness for anybody?
I think we need to be very worried about the fact that our young people right now are taking a hit in many ways, which includes not just higher housing prices, including rental prices, and higher, but also the fact that their incomes are not keeping up, and the unemployment rate has gone up exceptionally. I mean, there's close to 500,000 now unemployed between the ages of 15 and 24 out of that 1.5 million. So that's a big concern.